On his arrival in the town, he made no answer to his father's first inquiry why he had come before completing his studies, and seemed, so they say, unusually thoughtful. It soon became apparent that he was looking for his mother's tomb. He practically acknowledged at the time that that was the only object of his visit, but it can hardly have been the whole reason of it. It is more probable that he himself did not understand and could not explain what had suddenly arisen in his soul and drawn him irresistibly into a new, unknown, but inevitable path. Welcome to our look at Book 1, and I just read to you a quote from pages 13 and 14, if you're using our edition here. And this is a quote, what I really like about it, it's reminding us that Alyosha is beginning a path. He is not fully aware of what's happening. We're going to see how it all unfolds in these 12 books. And so what I'd first like to do is just give a basic summary of what you've read in Book 1 and encourage you, if you're behind and you haven't read Book 1 yet, that's okay. You could look at the link and just listen to it. And Book 1 is pretty short, so if you're behind, you can catch up easily. Now, in Book 1, I want to draw our attention to two important facts about time, because I do think time's important in this novel. I want to keep in the back of our heads that this novel covers a little more than 2 months, but it's compressed into a mere 6 days. Dostoevsky does things like this. It takes place 13 years earlier than when it's being written. And the current time of the novel is when Dostoevsky is actually writing the novel, around 1878, 79, 1880. We get the feeling it takes place sometime around 1865. I think if you listen to our previous teachings about history, it's good to keep that in mind. Dates are important when we think that in 1861, the serfs were released. Okay, so just things to keep in mind. Well, these first 3 chapters that we looked at in Book 1 provide just basic information about the patriarch of the family, Fyodor Karamazov, who we learned suffered, quote, a dark and tragic death. He began life as a small landowner, we learned. We don't know the name of the town, by the way, until Book 11. And maybe by Book 11, I'll figure out how to say it, because it is such a long, hard word. I do know that in English, a loose translation, it means cattle roundupville, cattle roundup town, but we'll see that in Book 11. We know that he first eloped with an aristocratic woman of a higher social status, Adelida Musov, and we know that he ran through her money, and we know that he lived a terrible life, and that she left and died shortly thereafter, leaving her husband with his servant Grigory in charge of their son, 3-year-old Dmitri. And we know that his father abandoned him and basically forgot about him. And then the child was taken to Moscow a year later by his mother's cousin, Musov. And we know he was passed from relative to relative, and he grew into a wild youth. And then Karamazov elopes a second time, this time with Sophia, who was an innocent, childlike character. She was psychologically abused by her guardian. And then, of course, she gets married and she enters into an abusive relationship, and he torments his young bride. She suffers from nervous hysteria and she dies. She leaves behind Ivan and Alyosha. They're 4 years apart, and Grigory takes care of them till they're taken away by relations. And so we take a look at that. Then in chapter 4, we find out that Ivan is almost 24. Alyosha, who sometimes is called Alexei, is 20, and Dmitri is 28. Alyosha dropped out of school. He enters the narrator's town, and as I just read to you, he's looking for his mother's grave. I think that's really important to remember, because this book is about forgetting and remembering. So the husband doesn't remember where his wife is buried, but the son is looking for where his mother is buried. So there's a lot within there about the poetics of remembering and forgetting. Alyosha decides to enter the nearby monastery as a novice. He's inspired by the elder Zosima, who we will look at. And we learn that, he's not a fanatic, he's not a mystic, but a lover of mankind. He is allowed to live in a cell, even though he, has not taken vows. And we find out as book one ends that there's going to be a family meeting in the monastery. So that's just a basic summary of what happens in book one. And I thought we should go through the questions. If you were able to look, we had a little sheet called book one, and there were 5 questions. And I thought it would be helpful to examine some of our themes by looking at these. So I had asked about the significance of Shakespeare's Ophelia, and I think this is a really interesting way to begin the novel. Now, on the one hand, Shakespeare is a strong presence in the Brothers Karamazov. I think later Dmitri is going to be likened to Othello, but it's kind of strange how Ophelia comes into this first part of the novel in the opening, and it's going to be connected also to the unique role of the narrator, which we'll turn to with another question. But let's just look. I'm looking at the bottom of page 3, actually, book 1. If you remember, the narrator says, "I knew a young lady of the last romantic generation who, after some years of an enigmatic passion for a gentleman whom she might quite easily have married at any moment, invented insuperable obstacles to their union and ended by throwing herself one stormy night into a rather deep and rapid river from a high bank, almost a precipice, and so perished, entirely to satisfy her own caprice and to be like Shakespeare's Ophelia. Indeed, if this precipice, a chosen and favorite spot of hers, had been less picturesque, if there had been a prosaic flat bank in its place, most likely the suicide would never have taken place." So there's a lot in what I just read that I'd like to talk about. First, I think it's interesting. Dostoevsky uses a literary device called interpolated narrative. And this is when the author takes a shorter narrative and puts it into the larger narrative. And Dostoevsky does this quite a bit, but that's the technique that he's using here. It's interesting that the narrator seems to kind of be contradicting himself, and the way Ophelia died is not exactly the way that this person died. So there's a little bit going on here. Just to kind of recap, Ophelia, of course, is in Shakespeare's play Hamlet. She's a tragic figure. She climbs into a willow tree, the branch breaks, and she drowns. So it's not exactly what happens in this case here. I'm taking some ideas from a Russian scholar named Susan Amert, and I think it's really interesting what she says about what we could call it an Ophelia digression. So on the one hand, some critics would say, oh, he's just dismissing this story. It's a digression. It's not making sense. He's contradicting himself. So in a way, the narrator seems to be underestimating Ophelia. However, look at where it is. It's at the very beginning of the novel. So I think Dostoevsky is also telling the reader it's important and we should pay attention. And right away, where Dostoevsky's already giving us conflicting interpretations of what exactly is happening. Also, if we were looking in Russian, which we're not, we would see that the sentence that actually talks about the suicide, it's huge. It's a huge sentence, and it actually has, I guess, strange grammar, contorted syntax. It's shifting the tone. It has kind of a disturbing feeling to it. And the author's doing that on purpose. Let's look at it a little bit closely. So the second sentence asserts the relevance of this woman's story to Russian life. And it gives us the idea that it has national significance, just like the Karamazov story itself. Also, there's a parallel with the main storyline with this family, because the young lady's suicide is in a way meant to shine the light on Adelaida's elopement. And I'll go back to that in a moment. There's an implicit contradiction in the narrator's characterization of the young lady's motives. So let's think about it. At first, he writes that she perished from her own caprice. Emphasis added there. But then later he goes to say that she was inspired by alien influences. So I want to go back to these isms that we were talking about in the first video. And actually, this is an ism I didn't really discuss. That now would be a good time. The author mentions here about romanticism. So this woman is being influenced by romantic ideas. Now, when we say romanticism in the 19th century, we don't mean romance between a man and a woman. We're talking about a response to the Enlightenment, where people were tired of the overemphasis on reason. So romanticism emphasized inspiration, subjectivity, nature. And so there were a lot of ideas floating around there. So Dostoevsky is saying this woman, think about it, what she's doing is not very Russian. This is a Western idea, an alien idea that influenced her. And really, we kind of even get the feeling that Shakespeare is alien here, just in the way that the figure of Ophelia is being misused. So we're going to see throughout this novel a lot. You might remember Fyodor quotes French twice in book 1. Dostoevsky will do that. He'll put those things in there to show how the Russian intelligentsia, the upper classes, the educated classes, they were taking ideas from the West and they're using them and they don't fit. They don't fit at all. It's not working. And so he's setting up the novel that way, very much to make that point. So the narrator has a strong anti-romantic bias, and he's explaining all this through a lot of irony. He's trying to unmask the young lady's real motivation. And then he's kind of also at the same time making himself not seem very reliable. He's making himself seem like he doesn't know what happened to Ophelia, since their deaths did not happen in the same way. But he's very much talking about the importance of landscape, because he says she wouldn't have done it had the landscape not been that way. And again, this is going to link to all the intellectuals in Russian society Dostoevsky's showing us. They're making decisions based on not for the best of reasons, okay? So in a way, the narrator is showing us maybe he only has secondhand knowledge of Hamlet, and we're wondering how reliable he might be, okay? I think it's interesting looking at this woman's suicide. At the way he does that, we can now compare the two wives of the patriarch of the family. Now, one of them, we read, she runs away. And she is meant to represent the liberated woman, the modern woman who wants to get away from oppression and have an independent life. And I think Dostoevsky would like to show that perhaps that's kind of a Western idea as well. And then on the other hand, we have Sophia, who is 16 years old. She is innocent. She is a victim. And in a way, they're presented as kind of diametrically opposed. And going back to the first wife who runs away, her ideas directly stem from the Enlightenment, which if you look at the Enlightenment in history, they would like to grant more freedom to the individual. They question or rebel anything that's going to be against that, particularly tradition, the family, society, the state, the Tsar, God. And so she represents a character who rebels against all of that. And she is definitely someone who's responding to those romantic ideas that are happening. And so Adelaida is seeing the world through this prism of ideas that she has absorbed from the West. And that's going to affect how she views things. Now, her emancipation, let's say, she runs away. This is a foreshadowing of how Ivan, later on, he is going to assert that perhaps everything is permitted. This is an important theme for Dostoevsky. If you've read Crime and Punishment, we know Raskolnikov says the same thing. they're kind of thinking about the character of Napoleon, but there is this idea that everything is permitted. And so Dostoevsky is introducing that here with these two women. And if we look at the other wife, Sophia, she is a victim. She is a tragic character, but we're going to see in particular in the way how Alyosha remembers her, she can still be a character that brings redemption, has redemption in the novel. So it's very interesting how he sets that up and how it all comes through this sort of strange figure of Ophelia. So very interesting in number 2, we're looking at the role of the narrator. And this is really interesting what Dostoevsky does. This is a very complicated narrator. First, I think it's interesting to draw parallels how the narrator is drawing from classical traditions that all writers would have been familiar with, and then maybe becomes a little bit more modern. So when we talk about classical works, we always talk about the epic. So when we talk about the epic, we know, of course, there's Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and Virgil's Aeneid. That is the epic tradition of the West. They're written in dactylic hexameter. But why I bring it up is they always open with the muse. Tell me, muse, of the man of many ways. This is the opening of the Odyssey. And it is the muse who is going to tell us about Odysseus and tell us things about Odysseus that he may not even know himself. And this is where in classical literature, the muse transcends the everyday person. They're aware of what's happening on a cosmic level. So we can see some of that with this narrator. At times, he seems to know things. I don't want to say he's godlike, but he does have some sense of, in some ways, he's omniscient. And so in a way, we could see that Dostoevsky's drawing on that tradition. Also, there's some elements that this narrator is like a Greek chorus. And I think that's really interesting also. In ancient Greece, with the growth of Greek tragedy, which Greek tragedy grew out of public rituals, public religious festivals, and there were actors on the stage that danced and memorized verse and recited them. And Sophocles is the most famous for bringing those to life. It might be worthwhile for here just a moment to look at a famous example of a Greek chorus from Sophocles' Antigone. If you look at this beautiful ode on love, this is on what is love, you can see that the purpose of the Greek chorus is to involve the audience, is to directly address the audience into what's happening. And the Greek chorus is part of the action of the play. They're involved. So this was very important in our Western heritage. It did fall out of fashion, but we do see some modern authors try to bring it back in their own way. For example, you may be familiar with John Paul II's play that he wrote before he was Pope. Karol Wojtyła's The Jeweler's Shop. He has a chorus that they address us, the reader. So there's interesting ways that they do it. So in some ways, there are some scholars who believe the narrator here is acting kind of like a Greek chorus. Now, sometimes this narrator, he's vague. For example, how old is he? Because it's not quite clear. He seems to have remembered knowledge. He says things like, oh, so-and-so remembered that for the rest of his life. So did he outlive that person? We're not quite sure. He seems to be a local because he'll say things like our town, our monastery. So it's interesting. This narrator is local and he's cosmic, both at the same time. The narrator describes some actions and some speeches in his own words. And he also presents others in words of other speakers. And so Dostoevsky will have second narrators, even tertiary, and it can keep on going and going. Let me just get you ready for an example that's going to come up later when we encounter the story of Job. It's cited by the primary narrator. It's then written down by somebody else. it's recalled by Father Zosima, who heard it read by a priest. Okay, so the question is, who's actually doing the narrating? And that's definitely a modern technique that Dostoevsky picks up. If you're interested in these kinds of questions, it's really Cervantes with Don Quixote in the 16th century. That's considered the first novel. And that's where the position of the narrator is unstable. We're not sure if he's reliable or not. That's very modern, and that's definitely something that Dostoevsky includes here. We could also say there's a polyphony of voices in the narrator because he seems to contradict himself sometimes. There's definitely some clashing. One really interesting thing Dostoevsky does is he will give a chapter a title, and then as you read the chapter, it will completely contradict the title or not talk at all about what the title is saying. So he does that as well. And one thing I think it's important to note with our Garnet translation, which is time-honored, I think it's from 1912, it's beautiful. Some Russian speakers don't like it because it hides the fact that the Brothers Karamazov is choppy, that Dostoevsky wrote the sentences in a choppy way so that we feel unfinished. We hear it and we think, oh gosh, this is not a complete thought. It's supposed to make us a little bit uncomfortable. Some people complain that the Garnet tidies it up a bit too much, but we know no translation is perfect. But I think it's just important to note, if we were reading it in the Russian, we would get the sense that the narrator's giving us a process, not a finished product, let's say. So I think we're going to continue to enjoy how the narrator will tell us things. There's a little bit of comic relief sometimes, and I think that is very interesting. Number 3, we're looking at the character of Fyodorovich, everybody's favorite character in the novel. Just teasing. This is a character, right, who upsets us so much. Even his very physical description, if you noticed in book 1, how Dostoevsky goes into detail about his face. And we're going to keep reading about how the brothers hate their father's face, what this face means for them, how he's such a contemptible character. But let's go into his character a little bit more deeply. Now, very much right here at the beginning, Dostoevsky is setting up the theme of fatherhood. And this is actually very classical. I mentioned the Odyssey earlier. That's a novel about fatherhood because the father, Odysseus, he's gone for 20 years and his son leaves to go and find him. St. Augustine's Confessions, that's a novel about how Augustine, he really doesn't have a very good father. He meets intellectual fathers, Manichees, who lead him down the wrong path. And it's not until Ambrose comes, St. Ambrose, that Augustine shows us this is what it means to have a real father. And so Dostoevsky is picking up on that tradition. He's opening this novel with a very bad father, with deformed fatherhood. But I hope you can already see in book 1, the elder Zosima, he is a father. And he is going to be a father to this troubled family. And that's something Dostoevsky really wants us to notice. So fatherhood is a very important theme. Now, when we look at this father, I think it's really interesting. There are seeds in his personality that are reflected in each of the brothers. And I want to go a little bit deeper with that. In fact, the positive traits of the brothers are actually found in the father. And I think this is so interesting because Dostoevsky, he will not let us have 100% pure villain. He just won't. There's some tiny, tiny seeds of goodness or potential goodness in the father that we'll see reflected in the sons. And the way I want to talk about this, you might find this kind of odd. I want to look at the topic of eros. So eros is one of the Greek words for love. So you're probably familiar that the Greeks have, many different words for love. In particular, people like to compare eros and agape. So eros is love associated with the erotic, with the senses, with good feelings. Agape is love that transcends just feelings. And for Christians, of course, we link that to sacrificial love, the love of the cross, okay? And just kind of a side note, Pope Benedict's first encyclical, God is Love, he actually reconciles eros and agape. A lot of times we tend to separate them, but he actually reconciled them. But I think looking at the framework of eros is a good way to look at the brothers, because all three brothers, they have, what would we call it, this zest for life. The Karamazov family is full of life. Now, of course, the father takes it to extreme. It's corrupted, but they have this zest for life. And I want us to think of a fire because, for example, Dmitri, he's described as having an ardent heart. Ivan, he has fiery rhetoric in his speeches, and Alyosha has religious fervor. So they all have these fiery hearts, these traits coming from Eros. And of course, they're all going to be confronted with whether they want to allow that to be transformed into agape. Now, Dmitri, if we look at him, we know we'll find out, he has a great appreciation for beauty, for poetry. He's passionate, he's compassionate, and he's willing to embrace suffering. And there's little seeds of that in his father. Ivan is an intellectual. Fyodor is not stupid. We know that in spite of him being a buffoon, he's able to make a lot of money, and he's very worldly in a certain sense. So Ivan has definitely that intellectual side. Alyosha, he's the youngest, and he's a symbol of Russia's future. And even whether, he's half drunk or however he is, the father has some spark of the awareness of the importance of the supernatural. And what I think is fascinating about the father, you're going to see in this novel, he's a compulsive liar. He's a buffoon, but a lot of times he ends up telling the truth. And it's really brilliant how Dostoevsky, how he does that. But of course, we see he makes a travesty of everything that he touches. But it is, it's going to be the journey of his three sons to bring some redemption to this family. And so Dostoevsky will not let us just conceive of the father as a pure villain. And we're going to see that develop more. In looking at question number 4, we are focusing on how Alyosha remembers events from his childhood. This might be the most important theme, perhaps, in the whole novel, because this novel is about how remembering and forgetting change our lives for better, for worse. And so what I think might be helpful, I'd like to call it redemptive remembering. And I think Alyosha is teaching us how to do it. I think it's beautiful how he does it. So the first term I want to draw our attention to is the word, I just want to talk about the word poetics. So when we talk about poetics, we're looking at a hermeneutic or a way of interpreting poetic drama, how to interpret it. This goes all the way back to Aristotle. So he wrote Poetics in 335 BC. And we could definitely say Dostoevsky has his own poetics of memory, and we want to keep looking for that in the novel. Now, we talked earlier about how Alyosha's mother is this tormented character, abused by her husband. But how does Alyosha view that? And I think it's important to remember when the narrator is showing us how Alyosha remembers, it's when, this is in the context of him looking for her tomb. He's looking for her grave that's been forgotten. So I think it's important to keep that in context. But let's read together. I'm on page 11. I'm on chapter 4, the third son, Alyosha. I'm going to go in the middle of that first paragraph, and I'm going to remind us here where it says that he became attached to the elder Zosima, it says, with the warm first love of his ardent heart. So just reminding us about the theme of Eros and how these brothers have, fiery hearts, okay? So here the narrator continues. But I do not dispute that he was very strange, even at that time, and he had been indeed from his cradle. I have mentioned already, by the way, that though he lost his mother in the 4th year, he remembered her all his life, her face, her caresses, quote, as though she stood living before me, end quote. Such memories may persist, as everyone knows, from an even earlier age, even from 2 years old, but scarcely standing out through a whole lifetime, like spots of light out of darkness, like a corner torn out of a huge picture, which has all faded and disappeared except that fragment. That is how it was with him. He remembered one still summer evening, an open window, the slanting rays of the setting sun. That he recalled most vividly of all. In a corner of the room, a holy image, before it a lighted lamp, and on her knees before the image, his mother sobbing hysterically with cries and moans, snatching him up in both arms, squeezing him close till it hurt, and praying for him to the Mother of God, holding him out in both arms to the image, as though to put him under the mother's protection. And suddenly a nurse runs in and snatches him from her in terror. That was the picture. And Alyosha remembered his mother's face at that minute. He used to say that it was frenzied but beautiful, as he remembered. So this passage here, there is so much here. And I think it reminds us that Dostoevsky truly believed no matter how dysfunctional a family is, if you have one fragment of one memory that you can place under the gaze of the Mother of God that's beautiful, you can cling to that and that can carry you through. There's just so much potential for healing here. And I want to talk about the rays of the sun. This is a very important motif for Dostoevsky. He loved talking about the rays of the setting sun. It's the sun that's setting, and they're slanting. That's very important to him. He was very fond of an artist named Claude Lorraine, who had some landscapes that inspired him. And so he will put this in other works like A Raw Youth. But what I like about this is it's definitely going to appear again with Father Zosima. So Father, later on, I think it's in book 6, we are going to hear about what happened to him in his life. And I want you to look out for that. He's going to talk again about the slanting rays of the setting sun. And it's going to remind us of the presence of the divine in all the things that are happening. And it's Dostoevsky's way of showing us how God doesn't forget us in the midst of, some of these very tragic events. So the setting sun is a symbol of God's grace and his presence in our times. And we just want to keep that in mind when we see that later with Father. In chapter 5, we meet Miusov. Dostoevsky tells us he's a radical from the 40s and the 50s. And in this novel, that means he's outdated. Okay, just so we know, he's supposed to be kind of passé, but he's still hanging on to ideas from the 40s and 50s. He is a progressive, a free thinker. He's not really a likable character, but he's very important, I think, for some of the themes that we're going to see. First off, I think it'd be fair to say that this character is Dostoevsky's way of saying that secular humanism has failed. Because let's look at what's happening here. So on the one hand, he's outraged at the way that Fyodor abandoned the boys, right? We read about that he can't stand it. So he's magnanimous. He's the hero. He volunteers to be Dmitri's guardian. Wonderful. Well, what happens? The revolution of 1848. And what does he do? He abandons him. Now we see, and this happens with a lot of these intellectuals from this generation, they are excited about the idea of loving humanity, building a social utopia. But when it comes down to the nitty-gritty of actually caring for another human person, actually sacrificing and being selfless, they don't have it in them. And this is a perfect example of that. It's an inability to attend to the reality of human life. And because this is a child that most urgently needed his care. And Miusov prefers grand gestures, which we see a lot in the 19th century. And we see that explode with the Russian Revolution. So you can definitely see how Dostoevsky is really a prophet about things to come. He doesn't like the actual duty of being present with another human being. And really, you could say this character, Miusov, is a narcissist. And it's interesting when you study the theories of these intellectuals, how they look on paper, and then when that person is actually involved in the human life, there's a lot of narcissism there. Maybe it's a little bit off topic, but Karl Marx, his daughter committed suicide. You definitely, when you go into these intellectuals' lives, you see these themes that are really there. Also, this character, if you notice, he's very self-congratulatory. He's very pleased with his performance. He thinks he's above everybody else. Now, this character is the opposite of Alyosha. And I wanted to kind of end our discussion looking a little bit more closely at a word that Dostoevsky uses for Alyosha, and it's the exact opposite of Miusov. He calls him a realist. And realism is so important for Dostoevsky. He really wants to show us how the intelligentsia were so out of touch with everyday life. So I want to read to you about how he uses the word realist. He kind of gives it a strange definition, if you remember. Now, this word realism is going to anticipate some of the discussions that we will see later on. In fact, when we go to the big court scene in book 12, the ideas of realism, we can come back to book 1 for that. So keep it in mind. Now, according to Dostoevsky, a realist is someone who lives and thinks in terms of an immediate reality. So you might laugh at that and say, well, that's just so obvious, but it wasn't for a lot of these people, especially when, we talked about the liberation of the serfs. There's so much discussion about how we're going to make everything better for the serfs, and then how maybe they might end up with a piece of land they can't actually use to get food. That's just kind of the nitty gritty of how it breaks down. Now, what's the opposite of a realist? The opposite is the theoretician. This is, and I wish I could say it for you in Russian, but this is the person who seeks to create a subjective world of his own. This is really fascinating. Going back to a lack of reality. For Dostoevsky, these early and later radical socialists are not living in reality. They're completely inventing something in their head. And going back to our discussion of, the romantic era woman and Ophelia, they're creating fantasy. It's not real. And so Alyosha is a realist. He is not living in a fantasy, and yet he can believe in miracles. And of course, Karl Marx is the theoretician par excellence, who takes theories, puts them together in the reading rooms of the London Library, right? And writes out his theory that actually does lead to revolutions, but it's not real. Now, in looking at Alyosha's realism, I think we should read directly from the book. I'm on chapter 5, Elders, page 16. Probably the first third of that paragraph. He says, I shall be told perhaps that red cheeks are not incompatible with fanaticism and mysticism, but I fancy that Alyosha was more of a realist than anyone. Oh, no doubt in the monastery he fully believed in miracles, but to my thinking, Miracles are never a stumbling block to the realist. It is not miracles that dispose realists to belief. The genuine realist, if he is an unbeliever, will always find strength and ability to disbelieve in the miraculous. And if he is confronted with a miracle as an irrefutable fact, he would rather disbelieve his own senses than admit the fact. Even if he admits it as a fact of nature, till then unrecognized by him. Faith does not, in the realist, spring from the miracle, but the miracle from faith. If the realist one believes, then he is bound by his very reason to admit the miraculous also. The Apostle Thomas said that he would not believe till he saw, but when he did see, he said, "My Lord and my God." Was it the miracle that forced him to believe? Most likely not. But he believed solely because he desired to believe. And possibly he fully believed in his secret heart, even when he said, "I do not believe till I see." I think this is just like a beautiful way that Dostoevsky puts in the doubting apostle here in a discussion of a book about modern socialism and communism and radical theories. He puts in that Apostle Thomas there in such a powerful way and wants us to see what it's like to see a real person confronted with doubt. And we will see Alyosha will have his own crisis of faith, but yet he's going to decide to believe. Now, when we look at Alyosha the realist, want to keep in mind he is the hero of the novel, and he is named after Dostoevsky's son who died. So Dostoevsky had two children who died. In particular, when his toddler son Alyosha died, he was afflicted. He suffered tremendously from the death of his child. And that's why you're going to see throughout this book, it is afflicted children suffering that affects Dostoevsky the most. And that is stemming from real experience. Now, as we're focusing on Alyosha, we can never leave the other two brothers behind. I just want to kind of close with, let the camera zoom out and get a little bit bigger in the ways that we want to remember these three brothers, because I think if we remember certain things about them, it's going to be a key to keep unlocking the hidden treasures of the novel. So in talking about Alyosha, you might have looked at your character map and you might have seen, well, first of all, he's also Alexei, he can be called. His name means man of God. So that's important. We have him there with the symbol of the onion. I don't want you to forget about the onion. It's going to come up in a surprising way when Alyosha has his crisis. It's going to be somebody else who tells him about the onion, someone you may not expect, and it's going to save him. And when Alyosha comes out of his crisis, and I hope I'm not giving you a spoiler alert, he is going to have a vision, this beautiful vision, which will take his already beautiful way of viewing reality into something even bigger. Because I don't know if you caught it in book one, the one weakness of Alyosha. I don't know if you caught it. He, in his own way, he's looking for a religious kingdom on the earth. He has his own romantic vision of how it's going to be when everyone converts and everyone's Christian and everybody sees the truth, and it's going to be beautiful. This social utopia of Christians, how Christians are, that's not fully grounded in reality either. If you've ever hung out a lot with Christians, you know we have our conflicts in Christian community. So this is going to be a test for Alyosha. He will have to be purified as well. And when he does, he's going to have a grand vision. So think of the onion, think of vision, and think of how his name means man of God. Now, let's talk about Ivan, someone very different. He is pictured with a glass of water. This is not going to be until the end of the novel. He's going to ask for a glass of water in a dramatic circumstance. Why is this so important? Well, I think we could forget that Ivan is suffering. He is a miserable person, and he's looking for some element of humanity to lift him up. He's looking for a glass of water. He's thirsty, but he doesn't know how to get out of his head. I think it's fascinating. So Ivan really, for us in English, it's John. Now, what on earth would St. John have to do with Ivan? He's certainly not resting his head on Jesus's breast, right? Well, it is St. John who wrote the book of Revelation, and he has apocalyptic visions. When Ivan writes his, let's call it poem of the Grand Inquisitor, it's terrifying. It is apocalyptic. There are elements there you can see in the book of Revelation. I would argue there's elements we're living through right now. So I think that's how we can link him with St. John. Now, I told you Alyosha has a vision. Ivan does not have a vision. He has a nightmare. So he is definitely a much darker character. And throughout the novel, remember, Dostoevsky wants to refute Ivan's ideas. So remember him, John, in the glass of water, and the nightmare. This is a good way to just try to remember. And finally, Dmitri. Now, Dmitri's name is so interesting. It comes from the goddess of agriculture, Demeter. She is Mother Earth, let's say. You might be familiar with the story from Greek mythology. Her daughter is Persephone, who's carried off by Hades, the underworld. So this is a representation of the earth. And very much Dmitri is our character that reminds us of the fact that we're flesh, that we have a pagan heritage. And he's the most romantic. He's the one who's always quoting from Schiller, from Goethe. He loves to quote poetry, but his very name comes from the goddess of agriculture. In your handout, you saw that he is holding a pillow because he is going to have this awareness of, through suffering, someone placed a pillow under his head. And this just gives him so much joy and so much strength to carry his cross. The pillow helps him carry his cross. And I just think that's really fascinating. Now, I told you Alyosha has a vision. Ivan has a nightmare. Dmitri has a dream. And I think that's very, very fitting for his character, that he is moved by a dream. And so as we close, just keep kind of those bigger images of the three brothers in mind as you go into book 2. Now, as you go into book 2, one thing I want you to look for is the act of bowing. So a bow for Eastern Orthodox people, bowing is very profound. And of course, they bow very low. So you're going to see through this whole novel, there's a whole lot of bowing going on. Some of the more disturbing bowing we're going to see later with Dmitri and Katerina. They're always bowing to each other, but why? It's a good question we could look at later. But in book 2, we're going to be at the monastery. So there will be a lot of bowing going on. And you're probably going to read and say, oh, this is normal. And then all of a sudden, there it is. It's my favorite part. The elder bows to someone for no apparent reason. I'm not going to tell you who. He bows, and it's so dramatic. And Dostoevsky doesn't tell us why he's bowing. Now, to be fair, I think it's book 6. Later on, the elder will tell Alyosha why he bowed to this figure. And I think it's really amazing. But one way to think about it, for the East, when you bow, you're asking for forgiveness. Now, what does the elder, what does he need forgiveness for? What has he done wrong? Nothing. Oh, but why does Dostoevsky do that? Well, in this novel, I think I mentioned to you on a previous discussion, Dostoevsky presents the radical thought that we are all guilty for everything and for each other, that we are called to atone for the sins of everybody, that we should even apologize to the birds. This is Dostoevsky's theory. It is really radical solidarity. Now think about it. If you study your communism, your socialism, your Marxism, they're always talking about solidarity, solidarity, solidarity. We're one with the worker. But of course, they never are, right? The highest leaders in the Soviet Union, they had the best apartments. But here, Dostoevsky's saying, no, 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 no. This is real solidarity, that we are all guilty for all. And so pay attention to the bowing and see what you think. See you next time.